Welcome to Jotkulture's Cultural Cues, where we have conversations about socially responsible intellectual property, intangible cultural heritage, traditional knowledge, trademarks, and other fun topics. All right. Good morning. I'm so happy to welcome Felicia Caponigri here to speak to us today about cultural heritage and cultural appropriation and other fabulous topics. And Felicia is an American attorney, founder of Fashion by Felicia. I love the name of the company. An author, a scholar. Felicia, if you'd like to start by telling us a little bit about yourself, and thank you so much for joining us at Jotkulture.
Absolutely, Jen. Thank you so much for inviting me. It's great to be a part of this conversation. So, as you mentioned, I'm a scholar. I'm a comparative cultural heritage and fashion scholar. That's how I think of myself. And I began my research and scholarship at the time when fashion was having an increased presence in the museum, especially in the United States. And as I thought about this topic, I realized that in the United States, because we don't have a very complex cultural heritage statute or law like source nations do, at times we don't have the legal terminology or even language to conceive of fashion and even other parts of our heritage as part of what we would term an American cultural heritage. So on that note, I looked to Italy because of my childhood. I lived in Italy for many years, but also I was very attracted to the Italian cultural heritage legal framework, as well as the history of cultural heritage in Italy. And I studied that during my PhD, and I realized that there are many big picture questions and tensions that Italian law has addressed for more than a century. So that includes everything from the difference between preservation and valorization, which I think we'll talk about a little today, or enhancement of the cultural interest in properties. Time, how do we decide centrally what is of cultural interest to us? And how it is that that cultural interest is shared across communities and across territories. So as a scholar, I'm interested in those big picture questions. And through Fashion by Felicia, I've started to work with a number of heritage brands. And that's something else that is present in my scholarship and in my work, this idea that brands also themselves have a cultural presence. In Italy, we see this a lot with historic fashion brands, or fashion brands that we might say have a real pulse on Italian culture, and also appropriate, if we'd like to use that word, from traditional craftsmanship communities in good ways, though, not always the bad actors that we see, but we see Italian fashion brands miss the boat sometimes too, as in the Gucci and Prada examples. And increasingly in the United States, perhaps where we're more apt to welcome facets of commerce or facets of our pop culture into cultural heritage, we see, Levi's, for example, with the iconic, that's a very hot, popular word now, iconic, with the 501 jeans and other, parts of our pop culture that are recognized as part of our heritage. So those are all some of the big picture questions and areas that are of interest to me and kind of what I do.
That's awesome. And there's so much richness in what you just said. I have like 1,000 questions already. But yeah, so you have a PhD and a JD, so it's Dr. Caponigri, right? So this is really your stuff.
Thank you, Jen.
And so, I mean, there's so many things that I want to talk to you about, and there's so much in what you just said, but I want to talk a little bit about Italy, right? So you focus on Italy and Italian cultural heritage law and what we can learn from Italy, but I'm going to ask you to break things down a little bit for us in terms of what we're talking about when we talk about cultural heritage. You talked about working with heritage brands, and I was like, what's a heritage brand, right? There's so much there. So can you talk a little bit, just to start off, about cultural heritage, what it means to you, what it means in the Italian context, and talk a little bit about how that connects with brands, if you don't mind.
Absolutely. So Italy's had, I would say, legislation on its territory since really 1820 that has regulated and recognized certain tangible properties as of cultural interest, such that their movement is regulated. So, of course, you know, in the 15th century, even in the Papal States, cultural heritage, I'd say, legislation came about because of the taking of marbles and other objects from the Papal States to be sold elsewhere. And so there was a need to really keep these items in the Papal States to protect them physically, but why to
Physical
protect them
cultural
and
items,
preserve them?
right?
Yes, physical.
Yes.
Yes, so physical, but also for education purposes, knowledge. So I just give you this background to say that today, the Code of Italian Cultural Property builds on very much that those origins, and has a very detailed definition of what constitutes cultural property. So if you look at Articles 2 and Articles 10 of the code, you'll see that objects of cultural interest that can include, you know, mostly art historical, but also anthropological, and other interests, also collections. So, you know, public museum collections are presumed to be cultural property. But the very interesting thing in Italian law too is that there's a line drawn between public and private. So whereas public items owned by the public are most often presumed to be cultural property, items that are also in private hands can be declared to be cultural property. And
And
so
what does
here we
that mean
have,
then?
you know,
Sorry to
yes.
interrupt
So
you. What
what
does
that
that mean when it becomes, if it's declared cultural property and it's in private hands? Like,
Absolutely, yes. So what that means, so this is, I like to joke a lot. This is why you might see people, you know, hiding things that are of cultural
uh-oh.
interest in their house, right? They don't. I mean,
It's like,
because really the notion is that the government sees an object or becomes aware of an object, and notifies you that the object is of cultural interest. Now, if it's in private hands, it has to have a slightly higher degree of cultural interest. It has to be particularly important, or if it's a collection or series of objects, exceptional. So essentially what that means is that the government lists your property as a cultural property. It's recognizes that under the law, and
right.
certain, you know, rights and obligations attached. So, you know, if you sell the property, you need to notify the government. In many instances, the government has a right of first refusal. You are obligated to apply for an export license in certain circumstances, even
Right.
if you're loaning the object for temporary exhibitions.
Right.
So, and of course, you know, you have a duty as the private owner to preserve it. And
Mhm.
in certain circumstances, when you're, for example, you're in a building that's of an exceptional historic interest, you might also have to open it to the public at certain times.
Okay.
So, you know, yes. So there are, but in you know, all the obligations and duties I've described, you see that there's this tension too in cultural heritage and cultural property law in Italy between private property
Mhm.
and cultural
Public,
heritage.
yeah.
And yes, and so historically, Italian cultural property law has built in these safeguards to recognize that, and here we get to the idea, right, of cultural appropriation, that in some circumstances, in order to recognize cultural interest, objects have to travel.
Mm,
So in that circumstance, you know, there are time thresholds. So individual objects that are in private hands and also in individual items in public collections, you know, have to be by a non-living author and over 70 or 50 years, depending on the category. So here I've just given you an overview of how the Code of Italian Cultural Property recognizes that tangible cultural
yes.
property tangible items can be cultural property. But of course, you know, Italy has recognized and has ratified the 2003 convention. They've also recently ratified the Faro
Which
Convention.
2003 convention are you talking about?
Oh, for the
Cultural
safeguarding
heritage?
of intangible cultural heritage.
Tangible
Yes,
cultural
thank you,
heritage,
Jan.
yes.
Yes,
So now
thank you.
we've gone from like the physical to intangible. You're talking about like the copyrights and the rights that authors have over their works, right? So more that kind of thing,
So
right?
really, here I'm talking. Yes, so really here I'm talking about things that we might consider at the international level to be folklore,
Yeah.
traditional craftsmanship. So not yet the copyright aspect. So
Okay.
so I would classify these as, what, so short answer, what can be cultural property in Italy? Tangible cultural property, intangible cultural heritage, that, however, and here we were getting a bit into the nitty gritty, but the Code of Italian Cultural Property has recognized in Article 7 bis by saying that in order to classify intangible cultural heritage as cultural property in Italy, it has to have a material element. It has to have material consistency. So
So
here we get into, yes.
question for you, right? So, I mean,
Yeah.
when you talk about physical items, I think it's easy for people to understand, but when we talk about Italian intangible cultural heritage, like what would be an example of that that we can get our head around in terms of intangible cultural heritage from Italy?
Absolutely. So if anyone watched Stanley Tucci's Searching for Italy and the Sardinian episode, they saw these Sardinian uh, men singing songs, and so that's one thing that's actually listed.
The songs.
Another thing that's listed,
Okay.
yes, the songs. So the popular the songs, right? The song making. Another item that's listed is also in Sicily, the making of puppets. So
Mm.
this is something, if anyone's also, I mean, I'll mention it if anyone's watched The Godfather, for example, and there are those scenes where, both in Little Italy, but also in Sicily, you see the very extravagant puppet shows. Those are also listed as part of Italy's intangible cultural heritage.
Mm.
Now, another example, is the Mediterranean diet. Here I've listed
The
things. Oh, Neapolitan.
Mediterranean diet is listed as part of
Yeah.
Italian intangible cultural heritage. The
Yes, it
Mediterranean
is.
diet. Oh, that is so interesting.
Yes, along with other countries. So it's a dual state listing under the convention. Another item that was recently listed in 2018 is Neapolitan pizza making.
Mm.
So that's another thing. And so, here you see also, I started out by talking about, popular culture, not in terms of popular traditions, but,
Yeah.
here we see also how intangible cultural heritage in Italy, because it's listed at the international level, but also can be recognized at the regional level, not in its material testaments, but in its processes. So regions in Italy also have lists where they recognize these traditions and know-how. You see also a relationship, and here we get back to your question, Jan, about brands. You see a relationship between what is traditional, we might say, culture, and what are products. So,
Mm.
pizza is a great example of this. Pizza is a product,
Yes.
but at the same time, pizza is the result of a traditional process in Naples. And so in my work, getting back to your question about heritage brands, for fashion, this is very important because you look at brands like Dolce & Gabbana, for example, who, have hosted a runway show on one of the most famous streets in Naples and regularly take, both images of Italy's tangible cultural property, so a painting, etc., but also build on lace making, other parts of Italy's intangible cultural heritage. And so heritage brands are ones which certainly in the fashion sense have a history of their own. But increasingly, you also see heritage brands, building as part of their brand identity on cultural heritage itself in an expansive definition of that term. I
Okay.
realized it was a bit of a long-winded
No,
answer.
no, that's great. No, it's a lot of details here. I mean, it's an area that is so fascinating but complicated, right? So it takes a few steps sometimes to break it down so people can get what we're really talking about. But so can you talk a bit about the link between cultural appropriation and this idea of Italian intangible cultural heritage? Because people use cultural appropriation in so many different ways, but you actually have different countries having laws, and Italy is a great example because, it's both the physical and the intangible. Like, what is the practical effect of this intangible cultural heritage, and how does it tie in with this cultural appropriation conversation?
Absolutely. So I would say so there are a few threads here, and as a first matter, I would say that the term of cultural appropriation has really only recently been imported to Italy from the United States. So, for example, if you do a quick search in the news about cultural appropriation in Italy, you will certainly see many comments from Italian activists who are of African descent, for example, commenting both on hairstyles being appropriated. I'm watching Sanremo right now, which is the famous Italian music festival that's happening this week, and Paola Egonu, who some of the people viewing this video, or you might know, she's an Italian volleyball player. Gave an excellent speech last night about, being Italian and being, her parents being from Nigeria. So really this idea of Italianness is expanding right now in Italy. And this is at the core of some of the tensions that you see too. So as a first matter, I would say cultural appropriation this term has been imported from the United States, and so is part of this commentary that's happening now in Italian culture. At the same time, if we think of cultural appropriation in its definition of, a taking from one culture to another with hierarchies, a taking that's unapproved, without consent, we can see how Italian cultural heritage law, and in fact, Italian culture, has been always about recognizing these takings, being very interested in context. So that's one thing that really also animates the study of Italian art history, Italian archaeology, but also recognizing that at times takings are inappropriate, and so seeking to claw back what has been taken. So I'll go in those kind of two examples. So the first example, especially with intangible cultural heritage, if we want to stay on that point, it's difficult to, and I know you've written about this too, Jan, protect or freeze intangible cultural heritage.
Yes.
And so many of the laws on the books in Italy instead valorize or try to enhance that intangible cultural heritage. So what that looks like in practice is everything from funding to listing to celebrating in festivals. And also this creates a culture in Italy of, we might say, acknowledgement. So, Fendi's Hand in Hand, for example, working with local artisans, naming the local artisans, showing the authenticity of their product based on this collaboration, this equitable collaboration with these workshops. On the other hand, cultural appropriation also is seen in Italy's regulation of the images of its tangible cultural properties. And here we get to examples that are not intangible cultural heritage in the classic sense, but images of tangible cultural properties that travel. So the Birth of Venus, for example, or the David. And this is, I would say, very much a hot topic in Italy, also because it has serious ramifications, because you can be sued in Italy for using an image of a cultural property that's in public hands for commercial purposes without seeking permission from the Italian state or paying a fee. So the examples, yes.
Can I stop you there for a moment? So that's quite interesting.
Yes, please,
So,
got me.
so you've drawn this distinction between intangible cultural heritage, right? So the songs and the puppet shows and that kind of thing, and the physical, the tangible, the physical cultural heritage. And so with the Birth of Venus, you're saying you have the problem of having taken a photograph of tangible cultural heritage. So it's not even that we're getting into it being intangible cultural heritage itself. It's the idea that you're taking a picture of a physical property and then using it. So that's really a very unique kind of, I would say that's a unique kind of legal protection for cultural heritage. I mean, so then you're really overlapping with the copyright. It's a very interesting question. She's
Completely.
like, yeah.
Yes, like, yes, exactly. No, and so exactly, just as you said, I mean, what Italian cultural property law does effectively under Articles 107 and 108 is claw back from the public domain these images. And, one recent case that involved, and this is again where, perfect example, because, we're talking about intangible cultural heritage. So a workshop in Carrara, which is, as many people may know, is famous for their marble. A workshop in Carrara used an image of the David on their website, and they were sued without seeking permission from the Galleria d'Accademia, and they were sued by the Italian state. And in this recent decision of last spring, the court said, first of all, there is a right under Italian law to the image of the cultural property,
Yes.
which the Italian state has. So number one. Number two, this right is grounded in fruizione, or use of the cultural property.
Okay.
And I really love what the opinion says, so I'm going to quote it, which is a qualified and complete process of knowledge of an object, of a reality that becomes a part of the heritage of the single and collective culture. So in having this right to the image of a cultural property, which the Italian court said is not like copyright in the sense that it's a non-economic right, it's not an economic right. So basically this public fruition, this use, is not an economic right like copyright. And this is how the court distinguished it. It's a non-economic right, which is grounded in the knowledge of a cultural property. So, and here we get back to authenticity. So this idea of truth that's in a cultural property and wanting to preserve that authenticity. So, a great example is in 2014, right, this Illinois rifle company decided to use an image of the David and superimpose some sort of, I don't even know what kind of gun, but let's just say some sort of gun on their advertisement. And of course, the Italian state was outraged. And so at first, when we hear about these, images of cultural property, using these without the permission of the Italian state, at first you might think, oh, well, that's an encroachment on the public domain. That's not right.
Like, why should they be able to do that? What's the problem exactly? You're stifling creativity.
Exactly. And, many of the same questions we ask when we talk about cultural appropriation, right?
Yes.
Like, why can't I use it? And
right.
the answer is it's a good faith attempt on the part of the Italian state, just like communities, are making good faith attempts to make sure that the cultural interest and value that is in that object is not, in trademark terms, we would say diluted. And in some sense, you might argue it's like a trademark, but really that it's recognized and carried forward and not tarnished. And, at times this can be problematic. Because we can see how this is a good thing, but at the same time, you might have uses that aren't like the rifle example, or, you might have uses like the Carrara example, where in fact, a workshop that is using it exactly as part of their, that they themselves participate in this traditional sculpture making, want to use it. But, the court said, but the way you're using it is you're using it to publicize your own company. You're not using it for this use reason, right? This public use, this knowledge. So to make a long story rather short and some takeaways, in Italy, if you're using an image of a cultural property for commercial purposes, being commercial is usually a trump card, although it should, in my opinion, and some of the scholars, be thought of in terms of degrees, right? So what I mean, because obviously art is commercial, but you need to seek permission from the Italian state and pay a fee. Now, here we get to copyright. There is, under Italian law, there's a very strong recognition that creative reelaboration. So in US law, we might think of this as transformative, right? To think about from a fair use standpoint.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you make a new expression from the original work, right? Yes. Okay.
Exactly. That kicks you out, if you will, of the cultural property licensing regime, right?
So then you're okay. If it's transformative use, you're okay. It's a new expression. You haven't used it.
Right. So if it's creative realization. So the example that, is often given is this case before before 2014, where a skull, an archaeological skull, was found in a rock, and it was digitally recreated, including the parts of it that were in the rock and were not able to be seen. So
That's so
the
cool.
digital rendering, yes,
Yeah.
yeah, it is. The digital rendering had these imaginative additions. And
Mm,
so there the court said, look, these imaginative additions are enough for it to be a creative reelaboration under copyright.
mm.
But, again, this brings up a question, that is now being discussed in Italy, but I feel like we talk about this more in the United States. And here I'm thinking of even, the Warhol case that the Supreme Court will soon rule on. What's the scope of asking for permission? So in the
Yeah.
sense that, what if you wanted to use the digital rendering in something that you were creating? Would you have to ask the Italian state for permission because it's the archaeological object and the second company or person that created the rendering? So, you get to really a layering of rights here, and it's an open question. As far as I
And
know, it hasn't been answered yet.
the Italian state is protecting this cultural property, presumably for the Italian people.
Yes.
Who benefits from the licensing? Does it just go back to the government directly? Is it distributed? Does it support further arts? Like, do you know? And is any of that, I mean, maybe it's not relevant to the question of how it's managed, but I think one of the things that comes up in the conversation around cultural appropriation in communities and how you protect things is who's going to be managing all of it, who's going to be benefiting from it, and who's the community. It's easy when you have a state, like a country, as opposed to sub-communities. But how does it work in Italy in terms of this protection and the state getting people to license images of cultural property? Or does that become a
So,
conversation?
so that's a great question. So usually the licensing fees go back to the museum. Now, after the museum reform, many of these fees are kept, in-house, depending on what the museum is. On the other hand, they might go to the Ministry of Culture, which then, uses it. And so, in fact, I was just reading today on the Giornale dell'Arte, the Journal of Art in Italy, they're the undersecretary at the Ministry of Culture saying, let's remember that fees for images of cultural properties can go a long way to supporting our artistic patrimony, meaning restoration, right? Other types of preservation, valorization, so enhancement, everything from helping to put on an exhibition to publishing a pamphlet about it. But that also, and this is a very touchy subject in Italy, that also begs the question of, and we deal with this in the United States when we think about deaccessioning,
When we think
is
about what?
our cultural heritage, when we think about deaccessioning,
Okay.
so from museums. So, is our cultural heritage an economic resource, or is it something else? Is it something that's outside of the economy? And so this,
Can't be
again,
both.
we get back to this. Yes, you're right.
Can't be
You're
both.
right. I mean, I'm with you. It
I
can
mean,
be
it's very
both.
interesting that they said that in the case you discussed earlier, that copyright is an economic right, but the cultural heritage was not an economic right, which is really quite interesting because, something that would be an artistic work would have been originally protected by copyright. And then maybe they're trying to make the distinction that you're not making money off of it forever, but that's not really quite the case if it is licensed cultural
Yeah.
heritage. I mean, it's
Yeah,
a false dichotomy in some respects, in my mind, but I mean, it's up for
no,
debate.
I think you're onto something. I agree with you. I mean, I think you're onto something, and I think that that's the one way, right, that cultural property law and cultural heritage law works, is because in comparison to the strong public domain and copyright. It works because it's about slavish reproductions for commercial purposes,
Right.
and the regulation is not based on an economic right, but it is based on this moral right, high ground, if you will, of we're preserving it for the Italian community.
Yeah.
So
No, I think
yes.
that's, and I like to think about a lot of these issues around the dignity interest of the groups that might be affected. But there's so much here. It's so interesting. We could just talk about this all day. But let me ask you, like, what is the one thing that you think we should understand about cultural appropriation and Italian cultural heritage? I think because, and the reason I ask you to comment on that is because, to my mind, there's a lot of confusion about what is cultural appropriation. And you even talked about cultural appropriation as a term that was introduced from the United States into Italy, into Italian conversation. So they were not talking about cultural appropriation in Italy, yet you have this strong protection for cultural heritage for generations now. So what, where is this gap between cultural appropriation and cultural heritage? And, what would you say is the one thing we should understand? Or if you could say one or two things that we should understand about how they relate and how they don't relate. Because I think there's an overlap, but there's also a distinction, to my mind.
Yes, yes, absolutely. So, I mean, the key word, the key phrase that I think of when I think of cultural appropriation and cultural heritage in Italy is "watch this space,"
Watch this
because
space.
watch this space
Is that trademarked
because
by
there's
Rachel Maddow? Can we say that? Watch this space. I'm kidding.
It came to my mind the other day when I was thinking of talking to you, because there's a lot of evolution and development that will happen in this space, because we
Yes.
see cultural heritage and cultural appropriation coming together in Italy
Yes.
in many instances.
Okay.
So of course, cultural appropriation, when we say it, we think, and you see this even in Italy and in reports, you think of things that aren't necessarily protected or recognized as cultural heritage, and so
Yes.
exists kind of in this negative space of the law. But Italian cultural heritage law has evolved over centuries, and it also is broad enough to encompass the evolving definition of Italianness and who counts as part of the Italian community, and what cultural interests we recognize. We see this in tangible cultural properties with, like, Van Gogh, paintings being recognized as Italian cultural property. And we see this also in conversations now in Italy about, well, how do we incorporate the Faro Convention and the right to participate in cultural heritage and the involvement of many different communities in our laws and in our understanding of heritage. So I would say a takeaway is cultural appropriation is different than cultural heritage in Italy. It has been imported from the United States. It often is used to discuss things like appropriation of hairstyles and to comment on what's happening in the United States too, and see it in the Italian space. Cultural heritage is more about what we might think of as traditionally Italian at the moment, although there are examples where the scope is, of course, wider. It includes tangible cultural property, instances of intangible cultural heritage, especially in its tangible forms. But the notion of cultural heritage in Italy is broad enough to encompass what people who comment on cultural appropriation care about. And so as Italy evolves as a country, as it evolves as a community, I watch this space. I think that we will see. I think that we will see more cross-pollination, as it were, between the two, and we might see Italians thinking of the taking of their own traditional cultural heritage in cultural appropriation terms outside of Italy.
No, I love that what you just said. That's just a terrific answer. And I think that it's, such a fascinating area. I mean, it's complicated and it can be difficult, but I think you're exactly right that this conversation, this area is going to grow, because we're talking today about Italy, but so many different countries have taken moves to, and maybe more recent moves than Italy, but so many different countries have taken moves to protect their intangible cultural heritage now, and not just their physical cultural heritage, which has been long recognized internationally. So I think it's going to be really interesting space to watch. And to me, a lot of times when people talk about cultural appropriation and they're talking about somebody's hairstyle, well, yeah, we don't get into that because that's an individual personal use. You said earlier, when you get to commercialization, that's where it triggers a lot of the time, even the Italian law. And so it strikes me that the cultural appropriation and cultural heritage can overlap when you are making an unauthorized use of some protected cultural heritage, but people just don't use that language, right? They talk about cultural appropriation in a very kind of relaxed way that I think is more, um, gets to more of the things that probably the law wouldn't touch, right? But, to me, it's important. We had that conversation about the law and ethics of cultural appropriation. And I think, people say, well, this is an ethical issue. And I think those of us that write in this area, we're like, well, no, it's not just an ethical issue. It's a legal issue. And maybe it's not as broadly understood right now, but it's coming, right? Like I love when you say watch this space, it's coming, right? Like we're gonna 5 years from now, people are gonna say, oh yeah, Felicia said watch this space. Now we're dealing with all this cultural
No,
heritage.
I agree with what you said. I think that's exactly it, and that's a great summary too. So it's an exciting area, and it's also an area where negative spaces overlap with positive spaces, where we have gray areas, and it really allows us to think of what works for our cultural dialogue. Some things work
Mm.
in better in different places. We love the law, but sometimes the law is too much and it's not needed. Other times the law is needed. And so everything that's happening now in cultural heritage and in cultural appropriation brings up these really big picture questions that all of us can contribute to.
No, that's awesome. It's definitely not a one size fits all. I really appreciate your time and your expertise. Thank you so much. Everyone, check out Fashion by Felicia, Dr. Felicia Caponigri. It's been our absolute pleasure to have you with us this morning. And we hope you'll come back and chat with us again as you're working on your different projects. Thank you so much.
I'd love to, Jen. Thanks to you. And thank you for this great initiative.
Thank you.